Great. Well, thank you, folks. It has been a very long day. We are deeply grateful to those of you who have been with us from the beginning or for long stretches of the day. We'll try not to belabor this, but I think it's a special opportunity because this film has gotten an enormous amount of attention. As you know, it was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary. It's one of the most widely discussed films about the contemporary Middle East in recent years. And so what's unique, I think, about this panel discussion is that this gives us an opportunity not just to screen the film, but to analyze it and to think it through. So I'm just going to go right into the discussion and ask our panelists, beginning with you, Mona, and then working back towards me, give us your sense of the film, your reaction, your thoughts, and we'll open it up to a wider discussion.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I had heard about the film, but I purposely had not seen it because I knew that it would be very intense. Watching a film like this at this juncture, it's tough. It's tough for me to see those kinds of images, particularly in the heady moments of the revolution before the army's use of violence and march. And I think that the narrative and about the first 45 minutes of the film was very powerful. And one of the things that I was struck by, even though we discussed this all day today, and as someone who's thinking about this constantly, is the repeated cycles of military violence against protesters. Over and over again, and of course these were prefigured, or these acts of violence prefigured Rabah, but it reminded me that with each one of these acts, and I'm getting right into the discussion here without really talking about the structure of the film, but I just wanted to just share with you what struck me first is in these repeated acts of violence, first of all, in retrospect, there wasn't always the level of outrage that you would think, and particularly with the Spiro massacre of October 2011, when the military ran down peaceful Coptic protesters outside the Spiro building, and then with the Mohammed Mahmoud, with each successive round of violence, it's eerily similar what protesters experienced. And what I mean by that is, if you remember the human rights lawyer Radia Al-Ran going to the morgue and the struggle over, the bureaucratic struggle over proving that the state killed protesters. This was replayed on a massive scale in Nabha when bodies were piling up in the only official state morgue, and it was a struggle to get the burial permit in order to bury the body. And in order to get a burial permit, you also had to get a death certificate stating the cause of death. So I suppose I'm just struck by how this was from the get-go of the revolution, a recurrent theme. And I'm just reminded that popular outrage wasn't always as visible as we would like. So the military was very much part of the scene, and it's not like the protesters didn't know that. So I was reminded of that.
Interesting. Dan?
Well, this is the second time I've seen this film, this time on the big screen. It's even more powerful.
Can people hear Dan?
Can you hear me? It's even more powerful the second time. Very moving. It's extremely difficult. I forgot that it tries to cover the entire period from the start of the uprising revolution all the way through the tomato protests and so on. It's an awful lot to try to contain in the film and to tell through several individuals. And given the enormous objectives of this film, in its own way, it succeeds pretty well. And I just think you have a very difficult task on your hands, and it's bound to make a lot of people unhappy as well, because they're going to feel that this or that part of it simply wasn't fair. I did find the first half of the film or so quite compelling, and then things speed up very quickly in the last year or so, during which there were very complicated dynamics, which we talked about today, which can't possibly be really exemplified in the film, and the way the film sort of finishes up, it feels a bit propagandish, to tell you the truth, at the end of it. I do feel that the cynicism of the military, as well as brutality, and is very clear throughout this film, and I'm very gratified for that. The manipulation of the military, of these political factions, is very clear, and the interviews with these cynical, outrageously cynical military leaders are very telling, and I'm glad that was there, because that is really ultimately, in many respects, as we talked about today, the core of the story in so many respects. The naivete of the revolutionaries comes across very well. I thought Magdi was a very compelling figure. I didn't think you really heard much from the Muslim Brethren as well in this film. So it was very much slanted in that regard. But for what it attempts to do, particularly given the fact that it really did drive home the brutality and the manipulation of the military, I think it does a fairly good job overall. I just find the last section of the film just goes too rapidly. It doesn't really, can't do justice to the complexity of the issue.
Compressed.
It's compressed, and therefore it's suddenly you find yourself dealing with all these events. The viewer has no context and no background in this, is not going to be able to grasp.
Unless they attend our conference today.
And that would really be the sole exception.
Yes. Thank you for those comments, Dan. Emad?
Well, I think it's really great that someone managed to document the revolution in its different phases and to follow the characters throughout. This is, I think, is a great opportunity. And for me personally, I think it's very moving because some of these were scenes and developments and events, I think, one sort of kind of resurrected a lot of memories. In terms of the structure of the film itself, I agree with Dan. I like the first part much better than the second part. Maybe because in reality also I like the first part of the revolution with the second part. like starting with actually the coming of the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power, I think I started with this deviation. Why I like the first part? Because I think to a large extent they depicted the power of that revolution, the image of that revolution. We tend now to use the word popular uprising and so on, but I think the movie to a large extent managed to show the extent of sacrifices, the people power, and the ability to go to the streets and take to the streets to defy authority. There are many confrontations between the security forces, and many of them were really bloody. Even the character himself, the main character himself, really got injured in one of them. And all the symbolic and iconic images of Tahrir Square, I think they were very vivid in the first part as a symbol of the revolution, the use of the public space, the idea of, 18 days of national unity, coherence. I think also briefly they referred to something that developed very briefly, the notion of what people call the state of Tahrir, or the state of Tahrir Square, or the spirit of Tahrir Square. This solidarity between Copts and Muslims, the distribution of bread to demonstrators, and even the guy didn't save some for himself. And I remember just a personal story, because the first time I went to Tahrir Square, I just someone just met me exactly like this, and just put like 2 breadsticks. It was almost breadsticks or cheese sandwiches, white cheese, like feta cheese sandwiches. And I forgot all about them. I went back to Notre Dame, like maybe 3 months later. It was my soup. And then I was just, like sitting like this, and then that was at Notre Dame, South Bend. And I looked, I found 2 breadsticks in my yes.
Good it wasn't cheese, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think this is really and they managed, of course, to depict all this, the singing, the festive life, the popular life of Tahrir Square. I would, of course, like to take each character as representing a trend, like the revolutionary trend represented by, for example, Ahmed and so on, Magdi representing maybe a trend within the Muslim Brotherhood, but I think the military and the military expert and so on, but I think again the rest of the story is not mentioned, like the people who, for example, the military managed to get to their minds with regard to early on, acquiring some some kind of negative response to the revolution itself, what we call the sofa party. The people that later on became the reservoir for the 30, June 30, and so on. I think they should have been there and how they perceive this revolution. I agree, of course, and this is one of the main criticisms to the film, that it took like maybe one-sided image or perspective of how to show you like the revolutionary liberal side vis-a-vis, of course, the Islamist that was completely absent, or at least portrayed as really very opportunistic and making deals with the military behind, and stabbing them in their backs and so
With the partial exception, arguably, of Maggie.
which of course is an exception. Maggie is an exception, or actually for me, the most of the rank of the fire of the Muslim Brotherhood, resembled men. Even the leadership might be somewhere, but rank and file, many of them defied the instructions and just went to Muhammad Mahmoud and all these events that later on the revolutionists claimed that, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood sold them out in these places or in these battles.
In that sense, Maggie is a really important character in the film,
Definitely,
an essential element.
Mahdi is really a central character.
Mohammad Fadel, I was thinking about you very much as I was watching this film, in a sense, well, it was your Boston Review essay, in a sense, which you revisited today in session 2 of our conference, in a sense provided the framework through which, or the prism through which I was thinking about this film, because a lot of, this is almost like a dramatization in documentary form of many of your arguments. At least for me. And so I'm wondering what you thought of the film.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that struck me is that if you were going to sort of characterize it sort of from a literary genre perspective, it takes a very comic perspective. There's not a comic conclusion, but it assumes that there will be a comic conclusion where everything works out. And I think that was part of the problem of the Egyptian Revolution, was that people like Ahmed here just thought that by just continuing to go onto the street, you're going to get some sort of good outcome. And there was no conception of the kind of, the prosaic plan of, how are you going to get what you want, much less actually what is it that you want. I kept waiting to hear for some sort of, concrete political demands or conventionally political demand besides slogans about more or less a utopian future.
At one point, there's even the statement that slogans are, in a sense, the core of the revolution.
I can't remember exactly. There was something that Khalid Hassan said that I thought sort of dramatized this point for me. I can't remember it now.
Yeah.
But basically making the distinction between revolutionaries and politics.
It's when they're in the cafe and they're chatting, and he says, we don't really do politics. We do protest, or something like that.
Something like that. There were several things, but I think this is the tragedy, right? Is the assumption on the part of the revolutionaries that because the revolutionaries, they have to win, right? Because they have to win, they don't have to have a concrete plan of what to do, right? That is really it's sort of ironic in that way, and that there's an assumption of comedy, right? But that assumption in of itself is kind of, in some respects, an arrogance about that the good always triumphs in the end, that prevented a more, I would say, realistic approach to what to do after Mubarak left.
Interesting. Ellis, observations, thoughts about the film?
Well, two things. Actually, I wanted to share a similar story to Emad's, because I remember going to Tahrir on January 28th. And this puts me in mind also Sami Mahrez's article comparing this to Amuda. And I remember actually someone meeting me and who was handing out sweets.
Yes.
And that was a very powerful moment for me, certainly in terms of these events. On the other hand, in terms of, I think this is a very powerful film. I don't think it's a terrifically accurate film about the overall nature of the revolution, in the same way that I don't think 10 Days That Shook the World or Red Star over China are terrifically accurate renditions of the Russian or the Chinese revolutions. But they're still probably the most widely read things that most people know. So I think this film will, I think it has real staying power. I think it will endure. I do think Maggie emerges as as the most compelling figure in the film, just as a human being. His children, his relationship to his children. I found his relationship to both his son and his daughter very, very compelling. And really very remarkable. And not because I find it, I didn't expect Egyptians to be this way. I've met lots of Egyptians who have exactly these relationships with their children and fathers who I deeply respect and have learned a lot from, but I thought to have it in film this way was actually very important, especially for a foreign audience. The one other thing that struck me, though, about the film was having spent time both in Tahrir and because of a medical condition, wandering around the area of Mohammad during the revolution, the notion that everybody was in the square, or that all the Egyptian people were united from the very beginning, and that everything was going the right way after the very beginning strikes me as misleading. In fact, lots of people weren't participating. Lots of people were actually opposed to the revolution. And the other thing that struck me about this was the degree to which it ignores at the very beginning the downs, the lows, as well as the highs. There's a kind of a story that people tell of euphoria. Almost as if everybody in the Dana Tahrir was drugged and were high all the time. And I also remember, since Mubarak gave more than one speech, I remember sitting in a friend's apartment with actually several leaders of the Social Democratic Party waiting for him to resign, and he didn't resign. And that was a moment at which there had been several before then, a moment of profound and severe anxiety, depression, sadness. And it was a period of both extreme highs and extreme lows, and that's already been washed out of the narrative, I feel. The one other thing about the army, besides their mendacity about who made the revolution and whether they protected it, is precisely that from the very beginning, and you probably remember this too, from the hair of the camel, but also when the street fighting was occurring in Tahrir, which doesn't really so much show up here, the army was standing aside, and I myself have a lot of photos that I took where you can see the army, the army guys are sitting in their personnel carriers doing nothing, while right behind them, Egyptians are trying to kill each other. Perhaps not very effectively, luckily, thank God, but nevertheless giving it a really good try. And so I think the notion that, even the notion that from the beginning the army was the protector, from my point of view, was somewhat misleading at this very beginning.
It's an interesting point, and one of the things that seems missing in this film to me is the role that the military plays in the second half of the film. So in the first half of the film, one of the things that's striking is the persistence of the opposition to the military after Mubarak steps down. The persistence of the demands of the revolutionaries who refuse to leave the square, who battle for the square, that it's not enough that Mubarak has gone down. They are at war with the military, they demand the downfall of the military, and yet, this is what seems really missing to me, conspicuously absent from the second half of the film. The role the military played in June 30th, which we didn't know as much about in real time as we do now, right? So these very kids, these very same people, the revolutionaries, who are going and putting their bodies on the line to do battle with the Egyptian military in the first few months after Mubarak's departure in the spring and summer of 2011, are in fact in a very different relationship with the military in the lead up to June 30th and its immediate aftermath. That is not in the film. It's not there. I'm wondering if anyone wants to address that.
Well, just to respond very briefly, because there are a lot of things that aren't in the film. I thought it was remarkable that they show, again, perhaps this is too much information. It's true that the army destroyed the tents on March 9th of 2011, but what that omits is that the square was largely empty, and the women's demonstration of May 8th was dispersed by joint, I don't know if you want to say popular Boltagi military action. So in terms of what's actually going on at this point, it's already a much more complicated story. I think you're right about a comedy. That's what it is. It's everything. There's supposed to be a marriage at the end, and everybody lives happily ever after. And I think that's actually a great story for a story of a revolution. Artistically, I think that's a great story.
Yeah.
But if you want to begin to talk about what's missing and what's not there, there's a tremendous amount that's not there. And what you want to put in that's not there depends very much on what story you want to tell. Sorry to be a kind of postmodernist narratologist.
This is why I'm curious. I'm actually skeptical that the film is going to have a durable impact, precisely because it has such a comic perspective. And right now, it doesn't look like the outcome is good at all. I mean, people might watch this and think, what the hell were they thinking in the way that they structured this? Because it makes it sound like, oh, it's just a temporary impact, right, on the way to, peace, prosperity, love, and brotherhood, right?
A setback,
Yeah.
as opposed to
I
a
think a
tragic
setback.
Yes,
Right.
a setback that can be overcome with the proper degree of romantic revolutionary will.
Yeah, and so, if in fact, some of the issues we talked about this morning, if things continue down the path that they seem to be going, I'm not quite sure whether people will, in 10 years, will watch this.
Well, the first half of the film might be regarded as a wonderful piece of nostalgia and romanticism. The second half of the film, I think, really falls apart in terms of the analysis. I mean, one of the things I kept thinking of, again, Mohammed, in terms of your essay, was how what you see happening with the revolutionary characters in their own brief moments of self-reflection about what they're doing, the forces that they're up against, their own limitations. You see that they realize that there is, things have shifted, but they haven't. When elections are held, when a democratic process sets in, the tools that they used in Tahrir Square in January of 2011, February, and the first few weeks and months after, don't really fit the story, the picture, the configuration, the landscape in quite the same way anymore, and they're kind of run out of ideas. And I think the film captures that, but doesn't quite give you a deeper sense of the limitations at work there. Do we want to take questions? Do we have questions? Joel?
I think we want to take the filmmakers to task a little bit in agreement with what we're saying. I mean, they have so much time to tell a story and have decided that they want to show so many minutes of story. And there's a lot to pack in. They came late to the story, obviously, because no one knew it was going to happen. And so they really missed the beginning. I mean, they're there for, I think, the 25th of January. I would sort of wish that somehow there would be more. I think we're reading into it a lot of our own experience in that moment, but I didn't really see in the film. I think, and that's missing, and I'm sorry for that. But at the same token, they stayed, and they're watching all of this. They've chosen a bunch of people to film. They've narrowed it down in the cutting room to 4 or 5. We don't know what's on the floor that they didn't put in. But they left at a bad time. I mean, this story is still unfolding. And I think it's really missed on their part not to stick around and tell us what's going to happen. So we do get a kind of happy ending. And someone calls the other and says, I wish I was there with you in Richmond, they mentioned how put them now. And one of the things that people kept saying about this point in time, you see it a little bit, is that Kitchens are really angry at each other in June, July, and August. And to go home and shut your cameras down, I think is almost deliberately backing away from the real story.
And to be fair to filmmakers, just as a structural reality of documentary filmmaking, you can only shoot for so many years. And then you do actually have to start editing and producing the film, lest it come out so long after the fact that it's entirely, irrelevant to the moment.
But I love Boyhood.
Yeah, right. That's an exception.
These guys had love.
Yes. Does anyone want to respond to Joel's point?
You know, it's interesting, the perceptions. I mean, the term comedy, I mean, to me, it feels more like, often like Greek tragedy. And there is this effort, a Hollywood-like effort to try to end on this positive note and this aspirational note, but what comes across are these very severe, profound, intense divisions. And one of the things I did think was done reasonably well in the film was to show how this Taqawir, which is not all of Egypt after all, it's not all of Cairo, but how Taqawir sort of manifest those divisions. And those of us who visited Taqawir over time and watched these, and you saw the intensity, for example, when people were praying this, and I experienced it there. Anybody who was there, there was tremendous tension in that square after a while. So I thought, in that sense, it left us with revolutionaries are naive, but they're hemmed in. I mean, there's an overwhelming sense of the conditions it's just not going to work. And so I thought, in that sense, it was reasonable, faithful to the complexity. It's just that in the telling the last 6 months or 8 months of the story, they simply there were so many things that they didn't want to wrestle with, they couldn't wrestle with. That's the very unsatisfactory part of it.
I agree with you, though, that it does convey, in a very visceral sense, some of the emotional reality of what was going on in real time, from particular perspectives, to be sure, but nonetheless, it captured a lot of the emotional power of the moment.
Can I just mention
Please.
the benefit of the audience, because some of the figures that appeared, without even putting the spotlight on, like Ala Abdel Fattah appeared in the movie.
Yeah.
When I say appeared in the movie, Sister Sana Abdel Fattah, and so on. Yes, and now these of course, I mean, they are Ala and his sister are in jail, of course, in the jail after the military coup, after June 30th. For, of course, reasons that everyone know, but this is, and I think also what this kind of imbalance in the treatment in the movie, because the revolutionary also, in terms of their association with other forces, right? I think this is something that will miss or deflect from the initial message, which I think, and this is where there is some kind of ideological maybe bias here, or political bias here, in terms of trying to show that the Muslim Brotherhood sold the revolution out, they hijacked the revolution, and that was the message that they wanted to run through the film. But actually, the second part, especially that led to the downfall and so on, I think the revolutionaries, and this was one thing that we always kept saying, they went into some alliance with the Fulul, the remnants of the old regime. Also with all the kind of enticement from the military for Egyptians to rise against democratically elected president and so on. So that again was toned down in the end. I don't think we'd be happy to show it.
That's what I was suggesting in what I said earlier about what was absent from the second half of the film, that element.
Right.
And I'm wondering what, because one of the things that happens later then, after this film stops, is that the repression, the crackdown of the post-coup regime extends beyond just the Muslim Brothers and Islamists and starts to ensnare in its net some of these very people, as you just suggested, some of the revolutionaries, liberal groups, secular groups, etc. And I don't fault the film for not capturing that, because they had to stop somewhere, but one of my questions, and this takes us beyond the film, I've discussed this with Mohammed al-Masri for months. I'd be interested in hearing his and other people's perspectives. For a while, it looked like there was an anti-coup alliance forming. That is to say, Muslim Brothers, other religiously oriented political actors on one side, who were the first victims of the coup and the crackdown, but then also some of these non-Islamist, more secular and liberal groups begin to organize against the crackdown. Where does that stand today? Where is the anti-coup alliance? Does it still exist?
I think, if you allow me, one major problem, and this is like a starking feature. The revolutionaries now, if they wish, many of them, of course, are, and I'm talking in terms of like direct first-hand experience. There is an element of fear that this is, as they always say, the wave is too high this time. And this revolutionary moment, we cannot expect it to repeat itself, not before 2 or 3 years at least. This is something. But there is also a feeling that even if they had the will to go into alliance against the military, against this current regime, there is a fear that any kind of activity that they might carry out might fall into the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood once again. This is one thing. The other thing, and I think it was also evident in the movie, there is also a fear on the part of the liberals or the Democrats or whatever, that any elections, they are not going to win. Any future elections might also lead to the coming back of the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is a major dilemma, of course, because this is preventing any kind of an alliance, as they said in the movie, that this is the unity and so on that can bring down any regime. And this is something that I think the regime also is aware of, this idea of, they mentioned that divide and conquer and so on, and forging this disunity among the Egyptians.
So one of the really interesting groups in all of this is a group called the Wasat Party, or the Moderate Party. They are what we would call, I guess, liberal Islamists. These are guys that in the 1980s and 1990s broke off from the Brotherhood, okay? Now they have been a part of the anti-coup alliance from the start. And the most recent development is just last week, they broke off officially from the anti-coup alliance. And initially when the news broke, it seemed like it was going to be something very negative, that, oh, you know, the anti-coup alliance is fragmenting. But it looks as though what the Wasat Party wants to do is they're trying to build a broad revolutionary base. They're trying to go back and reach out to these liberal groups who don't view them with as much suspicion. And I thought the response by the Muslim Brotherhood was very interesting. They just released a response, it was either yesterday or the day before. And again, I was kind of waiting. I thought, well, maybe they're going to say that this is bad news. We're upset with the Wasat Party. They said, we fully welcome this. We hope that they're able to establish this group. And if they do, we're going to be the first to join it. So that's kind of the latest on that. And maybe, I don't know if Dr. Emad wants to add something to that. The other thing I wanted to say quickly is, I don't like the fact, and this is just my opinion, people could disagree with me obviously, but I don't like the fact that we just adopt the term revolutionary to address the people that the film calls revolutionary. I think we need to problematize this a little bit, because I think it assumes, number one, that the Brotherhood is not revolutionary. I think it's fair and true that the Brotherhood doesn't deserve as many revolutionary points, if we're going to dish them out on a scale, as the liberals, because they didn't call for the January 25th revolution. But there are some important facts. The Brotherhood joins the revolution very early, officially, on the 27th, according to even the liberal analysts. They lost many people in the revolution. You know, many of the quote-unquote martyrs were from the Brotherhood. They protected the revolution, they protected the square by the testimony of the liberal revolutionaries. And I think it's also important to note that the Brotherhood was there in an unofficial capacity on the 25th and on the 26th, from the very start of the revolution. The Shabab al-Ikhwan, the Brotherhood youth, were there. These are important things to remember. It's also important to remember that the people that we keep casually referring to as revolutionary actually very nonchalantly fed the counter-revolution and participated actively in it. So I think it's kind of problematic that we keep saying the revolutionaries, the revolutionaries, the revolutionaries, when I think one could argue that they're maybe not as revolutionary as they have claimed.
Well, they are revolutionary in this sense, at least, is that they think, or they seem to think, or this is maybe my perception of them, and I think it comes out very strongly in this film, is that you can have a future order in Egypt that transcends politics. There's a kind of utopian vision that I see in the discourse of the people that are called the revolutionaries. That you can build a new order that's going to be free of partisan division, that's going to be free of political parties, that's just going to be all Egyptians, no Copts, no Muslims, no capitalists, no socialists, that there's not going to be any kind of subgroup affiliation. It's going to be spontaneous order, right? It's gonna be spontaneous order. And that's what seems to me the kind of revolutionary ethic that comes across in this movie. And I see, and that's what I tried to capture a little bit. You know, some of my friends in Egypt deny, oh, that's not really true. They were much more realistic than that, but I frankly can't see it.
They themselves term it as transcendent revolution. Transcendent. It transcends ideology, transcends class, it transcends religion. And this is the term that they use. ثورة متجاوزة.
You know, I mean, when we think about revolutionaries, we do think that there is this aspect to their goals and their thinking. But I think that for viewers who are not sort of more familiar with the sort of political science issues, which I still think are important and relevant to this film, but don't obviously get explained, transitions are not about revolution. Transitions are about negotiated outcomes in which one party, the so-called reformists or soft-liners, they negotiate with the others, and you've always got to have the revolutionaries there to give leverage to the negotiators. And this is what happened in Iran with Khatami. Khatami sort of gave up the students, and the students had these revolutionary expectations, and once he basically decided to make peace with the regime, he lost their capacity. You need some sort of coordination between the revolutionaries, whose transcendent views are necessary and inspiring, and the hardcore sort of reformists who are going to cut the deal. And so the revolutionaries say, we want the end of the regime. Yeah, sure. We want the end of the military. Yeah, sure. I mean, as much as I'll be negative about the military, there's no way around it, at least in the beginning, cutting a deal.
And in fact, they're hostile to the fact that the Muslim Brothers cut a deal.
Of course, because in this case, those cutting the deal and the revolutionaries are completely divided in that sense. There's no effective division of labor in the way that would have made them more effective. They simply want that whole system to come crashing down, and that's not possible. But they cannot come to terms with the Muslim Brethren on that.
Yeah.
Well, actually, there's people on the
Well, you know, I've been trying to think all along what I would call Ahmed and the actor, and I've been thinking, what would I call them, what would I call them? And you made me realize they are evolutionaries. They have this idealistic view of revolution is going to lead to evolution of mankind, and they'll never get there because they're going for something that like you say, utopian. So they're really evolutionary. And when they had the conversation in the cafe, they said, we don't compromise. And that's what apparently the Muslim Brotherhood did, whether on a higher level or, you know, something a little less with dignity. But that's the compromise, apparently, that they were saying, we don't know how to do that. We're too idealistic. And I know they were the leaders of it, and other people had probably more realism, but as leaders, as people really, that was their problem.
Yeah, I think one of the tragedies is that utopianism arguably led to a dystopian moment. The refusal to compromise on one level actually morphed into a collaboration with some very dark forces on June 30th. And so it's not a consistent utopianism or a consistent refusal to compromise. It was a sort of abstract, existential refusal to compromise that ended up putting them on the same side as the most repressive force in the entire society, the military.
And I think even at one point, I remember Mubarak saying, I will step down in 4 months. And I remember thinking, that might not be such a bad thing. Whether he really means it or not, it was to be seen. But, you know, democracy, these young people all wanted this instant thing, Twitter, you know, Facebook, but our democracy takes time. It's a long process, and it doesn't happen overnight. And that 4-month interlude might have given them something that they would have, an alternative they would prefer.
Any final, yes, Shafi?
Yeah, I felt that, so I watched it this was my second time watching it, and there were certain parts that kind of stuck out for me a little bit more, maybe just because of the conversation we had earlier today. But there were certain moments that seemed to me so absurd, especially with what we know now. And I felt this also the first time. The ending is so is like incredibly detached from reality, and it's almost laughable, and you almost feel like, yeah. But I guess the bigger issue, I think, is this kind of assumption that revolutions change something fundamental in a people. This idea. So there was the main character. He says something like, "We know the military is coming back. We're ready for them. They're not going to be repressive this time, or they can't do what they were doing before. They've learned their lesson." And the fact that he couldn't envision a possibility where the military would be unprecedented, like brutal in an unprecedented manner, the fact that he couldn't grasp that, and I think that comes from this idea that there's this idea of a protest culture. I actually think in many ways it's the opposite. I mean, if you look at countries that have gone through deeply polarizing civil conflict in the Arab world specifically, like Algeria after 1991, also Syria after the 1982 massacre, it takes them decades to recover because they reached that revolutionary potential, and then the result was so devastating and so exhausting and tears apart society, the very fabric of it, that you can't really get back. It takes a very long time to recover. I'm actually very much in the extremely pessimistic school. I don't even think 2 or 3 years. That would be wonderful if this regime would be weakened in that time. But I think we have, I think we're talking about a significantly longer period. I wouldn't be surprised if we have a 10 to 15 years Sisi's in power, if not the 18 years of Pinochet. I think for a variety of reasons that we can't really get into right now, I think this regime has a lot going for it. And I think if we watch this movie 15 years from now, and some form of this regime is still in power, the ending is already incredibly absurd, but it's going to be even more absurd 10 years from now.
Ellis, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, one problem, though, it seems to me, with some of our arguments is we focus on particular moments. So, for example, the criticisms of the Muslim Brothers for negotiations with the army begin with the wise men. I mean, they begin right after they don't just happen somehow much later. That's a real question. It's a real debate that people are having, and it happens from the very beginning, and it's never resolved. And I think what you see over those 3 years you see an increasing level of violence by the army and also within society. I mean, it's easy now to forget some of the social violence. The lynchings, the crucifixion. I mean, I don't want to belabor this point, but certainly there was a profound sense that social public order was breaking down to some degree as a wave of violence was engulfing society. The military becomes more violent over time. So each, as I think is one of pointed out, at least implicitly, and I'm going to make it explicit, each successive time there's more violence. The other thing that is missing from this film, and that a group of actors that we haven't talked about, either at this conference, in the Boston Review piece, or tonight, of course, is the Ultras, who actually played a very important role. The Ultras played at least as important a role in the events of the Camel as the Muslim Brotherhood. They would, if we had an account of them, and to my knowledge, with the exception of one book that's been written, nobody's really investigated who they are. They represent a much broader cross-section of Egyptian society. They're probably much more working class. They have their own martyrs, their own culture. They're much more into, I don't know if anybody's ever been at their, forget the soccer games, just their public demonstrations.
When you say ultras, you mean the Salafis?
No, I mean the soccer fans.
Soccer fans, sorry.
The ultra white knights and all the other guys.
Oh, James Dorsey.
Yeah. Well, okay, so having been at the other end of some of their use of flares, it's pretty frightening to have these guys stick a flare in your face. Trust me. But they're missing from this narrative. They've been missing from our narrative here, and I think part of that isn't just an oversight. I mean, part of it is, okay, you can't fit everybody into the story. But part of it is that they represent an aspect of the revolution that, frankly, we're all pretty uncomfortable with. We don't know really how to put this kind of spontaneous activity and spontaneous violence into it. And one other thing that I think is touched on very lightly in the film but is part of this emergent conflict between
whoever you want to call them, the revolutionaries and the Ikhwan, is precisely over the issue of organization. Because when you had those dueling demonstrations in November 2012, okay, we can all sit here and say, well, the Muslim Brothers were really organized. But it was a point of pride for the revolutionaries, or whoever they are, whoever you want to call them. And I don't think they played leadership roles. They kind of stood up like Charlie Chaplin with the red flag, and then a lot of people turned out to be behind them for a long period of time. Unlike the ultras, who I think were a more consistent and coherent group of people. But they were always proud that their demonstrators were spontaneous. I don't know if I'm sure some people here must have had these same discussions. So our demonstrators showed up. We didn't have to organize them. They came, they represented the real Egypt. They got there on their own, and they went back on their own. Whereas, well, plus their demonstrators did. They paid for buses, and they got people there because, well, they were ordered to show up, and so they did. So ours were real demonstrations. Theirs weren't. And the frightening thing, I think, that, again, I haven't seen anybody really, I think somebody mentioned it during the course of the day. For me, the really frightening thing in November 2012 was that brief period when it was clear there was going to be an anti-Morsi demonstration in Tahrir. And for about a week, it seemed as if the Ikhwan might also have might bring their demonstration to Tahrir, and then they decided not to. I don't know what you guys all think about any of this stuff, but I was there, and the notion that you were going to have two demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people who violently disliked each other by this point. We're not looking at Magdi and Ahmed, we're looking at a very different group of people. And that that there was a possibility that they would be led into direct confrontation in the middle of Cairo was not a reassuring thought. It was a frightening thought. And my sense was it was possible at that point.
Josh, you wanted to make a comment?
I'm good.
Mona, did you want to make any closing comments?
Yeah, I'll say something about the form of the film since I focused on the substance at the beginning, but I want to pick up on something that Dan said about the tragic strand that runs throughout the film. I don't know if this is intentional on the part of the filmmaker or not, but I think that it wouldn't be unreasonable to take away from this film. The key takeaway is that change is always thwarted. That as much as you may be motivated or idealistic, or you're always, and we were talking about this upstairs for a bit, you're always going to get thwarted by those opportunistic, cynical politicians. Not just the Muslim Brothers, but whoever's on the top. In fact, I think one of them says that basically we're big players or pawns in this shadow play that's conducted by the big people on top. And that's an ingrained belief in many places. It's not at all a comedic or empowering narrative. It's the perfect microcosm of elite level politics, that we don't matter, or we are too idealistic for the dirty work of politics. And I think that's a very disturbing takeaway, but I think it works perfectly as a as a dramatic form. This could be a drama, a feature film that shows that no matter how hard you try, you're always going to be thwarted by those dirty politicians who sell you out. And I think that has a lot of purchase actually in Egypt right now, and even before the military coup.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, and the sense of absurdity. Okay, now Josh does want to weigh in. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking about was that, there's been some sort of narrative that the protesters were so disorganized, they didn't know what they wanted. They didn't even at times understand what is happening to them. And I don't know, I guess I pushed back on that a little bit. I saw people having pretty in-depth conversations about politics. And, this is in a society where you never would have talked about whether we're going to have a parliamentary or presidential system 5 years ago. So I think that there is some political learning there. And I think that the way that the film ends up maybe is not so great, but the military is like sowing the seeds of its own sort of opposition, right? And so, maybe it lasts 10 years, but I'm not willing to cede them that victory just yet. I mean, there's a lot of politics that are still going to be played here.
Well, speaking of that learning, here's a question just to perhaps end with. To what extent are Egyptian liberals today, now that we have a year, a little bit more than a year since the coup, to what extent are Egyptian liberals today who participated in June 30th now realizing what Shadi described as the complete absurdity of the note on which this film ends, this kind of romantic revolutionary comedy of, we just have to remain steadfast and kind of will the future into being and remain in a constant state of opposition. I mean, to what extent are Egyptian liberals realizing that they made a tragic error in allying themselves with the military and bringing down this democratically elected government, rather than taking the long road, the slow, prosaic, as Mohammed said, work of politics and organizing and building an opposition party, contesting elections, etc. I'm just curious, as an empirical question, to what extent are Egyptian liberals today having those discussions, realizing that they made a mistake?
I don't think, if we're talking about the leadership, like people like Baradei or Ziad Bahrain or Amr Shukri or others, I don't think, I haven't seen any one of them publicly coming out and said, we made a mistake and we regret what happened and so on. For them, I think they make a distinction between the fall of Morsi and the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was okay for most of them. That was okay and still okay. And then they differ on what ensued. The massacres, they differ on this. Like Baradei, he took apart in terms of approving, but then the extent and so on, he resigned and left. Ziad Bahrain, for example, and I know that as a fact, he stayed on, even after the massacre, and for two simple reasons. One is that he would not be regarded as a follower of Baradei. If he had resigned quickly, so people would say, he followed Baradei and so on, and he doesn't have. And he always thought that he can reform from within. Like this liberal, moderate voice could stay within this military-led government and can make any kind of reform or change. The part of the story, I think, that they regret, and that's my personal opinion, is that they thought that the military would hand over power to them immediately, as they said here, that they are calling for early presidential election, transitional government, most probably that they will lead, and then that would lead to an election that the military and these kind of pro or anti-reform judges will supervise and then can guarantee some kind of victory. But the idea of, bringing or affecting the whole democratic transition or democratic process and fear of regret for doing this, I don't think many of them, even the ones that we consider as really kind of still steadfast liberals.
Hamzawi seems to have shown some regret. I was at a workshop at Waterloo University and he participated by Skype since he can't travel. And he seemed to suggest that, that Egyptians of this tribe needed to completely rethink their conduct in the post-Morsi election period.
Hamzawi opposed the coup from the
Exactly.
beginning, so he wouldn't really count as a mea culpa.
That's right.
I'm only aware, I was just thinking about it right now, I think there's either 3 or 4 prominent liberal revolutionaries who have publicly offered mea culpas. One is Ahmed Maher, I think Alaa did as well, Khaled Dawood from the NSF, and who else am I missing? Maybe Mustafa Nagar, I think, would be the 4th. So I come up with 4 right now. That's like a very, very small number.
I'll
Do
just
you
add,
regret bringing down Morsi or the June 3rd or they make a distinction?
They're not very, so Ahmed Maher, for example, came out and said that this regime is worse than Mubarak, and Alaa said something similar. They don't really make a distinction between, so maybe you're right that they're not criticizing the first part, but only what happened after.
Exactly.
So maybe the answer would be 0.
no, it's actually 1, because the human rights lawyer, Aida Sifadowla, and it's got a lot of traction, she wrote on her Facebook page, I will never forgive myself for signing the Hamadou document.
There we go. That's what I had in mind, that's
So
only
there
that
may be
far.
others, but she was the one who was the most unambiguous about blaming herself, not for July 3rd, but for June 30th.
So we have one.
Can I ask why you want to focus, I realize that the liberals are a point of particular interest here, but I would say that the Noor Party has played a much more important role in stabilizing this regime than the liberals have. And it seems to me that the Noor Party, depending on your point of view, has been either, at least the party leadership, I realize the base may have gone, some of them may have gone in different directions, but the leadership of the party, depending on your point of view, has either been much more realistic or much more cynical about events since June 30th. And I'm surprised that they seem to escape our view. Again, kind of like the ultras, in one way, they escape our view in the other way.
I'll tell you why I know, because I thought that the Salafis in Egypt from the very beginning had the capacity to completely undermine the success of the revolution. You know, again, I referenced this, you know, in my presentation this morning. I talked about this short essay I published in the Journal of Middle East Governors or whatever. And I try to say that the only way the transition can succeed is some kind of alliance between moderate Islamists and liberals. And in that piece, I specifically flagged the threat of the Salafists, because I thought that they had no stake, no genuine stake in a democratic Egypt. And that was evidenced by their behavior during the revolution. I mean, if we want to talk about people hijacking the revolution, I think they're a really good candidate, because during the entire period of the revolution, they were essentially calling on the military to crush the people in the streets, right? Executing Barad'i, et cetera, et cetera. And then as soon as it was over, suddenly they decided, previously democracy was kufr, you know, polytheism. Suddenly now they're gonna start competing in elections all of a sudden, right?
The many Salafis joined the square towards the end. There was a big divide within the Salafi community. Some did do what you said, but others actually
Particularly the
participated.
shuyukh,
Yeah.
right? They were the ones that were adopting the most extremist religious rhetoric during the transition period, right? At the same time, they were perfectly happy to be quiescent during Mubarak, right? And suddenly they would start making maximalist demands during the middle of a very tenuous democratic transition, when they were perfectly happy just being, you know, left alone in the Mubarak era. It's just really weird.
Well, what I'm saying is they played a much more active and prominent role. They've been much more, I mean, again, I don't know who else here reads El-Ghobashy, I happen to read it still quite frequently. They've spent a lot of time thinking about this and figuring out where they want to be. And they're much more vocal than the liberals. I mean, the liberals, you may be right that none of them have said they're sorry, but they tend to be a little bit skittish about discussing some of these things. As far as I can tell, the Salafis pretty much from the beginning have been quite vocal about, well, this is how it is, and we're going to go with it. And I'm just, again, I say I'm surprised, they don't seem to figure into our discussions as an important political force or a force that affects the outcome of this. And that seems strange to me.
It's a good point. I mean, they are missing from the analysis. I would say, from my perspective, why am I more focused on the liberals? Because to me, the liberal actors in the revolutionary drama contradicted their own stated principles. They tripped in ways that Mohammad Fadel has anatomized, I think. There were tensions and contradictions within the liberal project that came unraveled in a very spectacular way through the revolutionary process and its aftermath in Egypt. Whereas the Salafis, to me, seem relatively consistent in being anti-democratic from the beginning, except in the most opportunistic ways. But they're just not as interesting to me in that sense.
Okay.
I think the contradictions of liberalism,
I guess
the Egyptian stories are very interesting.
That strikes me as being the way that we Americans like to look at the world, which is the contradictions of people who we think are like us, as opposed to the actual array of forces on the ground in a particular place and time. So I would say the Salafi movement turns out to be very important. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about these issues because they reflect very much on our own sense of the world. That's all.
But I think in this particular incident, I mean, after July 3rd, I think the liberals played a more important role in terms of legitimizing the coup and providing a political cover. Because in the cabinet, for example, not a single Salafi participated, but most of the cabinet that the Sisi formed after the coup mainly or predominantly came from the Social Democratic Party and from liberals, not from Salafis.
Abdullah, did you want to make a closing remark? Okay. This has been a rich discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists and all of you for your marathon endurance here. It's been a very long, fruitful, and stimulating day of discussions. Thank you for staying with us to the end. You all deserve a prize. And thanks to all of our speakers at the conference for making this day, I think, quite memorable. The